What's the most horrifying death you have ever heard of? You can get a dose of radiation that's fatal, but not instantly fatal. Patient 1DN from the Leah radiological incident took 893 days to die. My friend's fiance was an underwater welder, diving so deep it was like being in total darkness. One day, he went down and never resurfaced. I can't remember if it was due to a rupture or a shock, but imagining him dying in such a dark, eerie place haunts me. Kyle McGarity pushed down a manhole and was boiled alive over several hours. He had no broken bones or blunt force trauma, and steam doesn't kill nerve endings, so he felt the whole thing until it killed him. Edit, in response to some points raised. It took several hours before his body could be recovered due to the heat of the duct, but his death may not have taken hours. I reread an earlier post and it says he was still alive when first responders showed up, and that the cause of death was scalding and not shock or cardiac arrest or suffocation. Either way, it was not quick. Those Trinidadian divers that got sucked into that pipe they were working on. One of them was able to escape and go for help, but the company or government stalled the efforts, and the other two ended up suffocating a few days later in that dark, cold pipe underwater. Most of the ones that really chill me have already been covered, but no one has yet mentioned Vladimir Komarov, the man who fell from space. First cosmonaut ever to go up twice. It became increasingly apparent during planning and training for his second mission, Soyuz 1, that it was terribly flawed at every level, but all official protests fell on deaf ears because of the bureaucratic culture of the program and the Kremlin. The whole thing had an air of doom, but he knew if he backed out, apart from all other consequences, his close friend and Soviet hero, Yuri Gagarin, would be compelled to take his place. The launch was a success, but after achieving orbit, the solar sail failed to properly deploy, leaving several crucial systems unpowered and obscuring transmission from communications and navigation equipment. He wrestled with the craft, trying to get it manually oriented for 5 hours, and through skillful piloting, partially succeeded. But failing thrusters and bad weather conditions caused Mission Control to scuttle a companion launch that was intended to aid him and to abort his mission. He had to stay up orbiting Earth 18 times without proper guidance systems, acting as a human computer and gyroscope to get it into a proper re-entry window despite the unresponsive thrusters. But he eventually succeeded. He was in radio contact with Gagarin, assuring him conditions were good. It looked like he may actually make it, and then the primary chute failed to deploy, and then the secondary chute got tangled in the primary chute. Then the retro rockets failed to fire on ground approach, which would have been right before he hit the Earth at 90 miles per hour. Some reports have him transmitting screams of rage on the way down. In a similar vein, I was literally nauseous with horror when I first found out that NASA covered up the fact that the Challenger accident wasn't immediately fatal, and that several of the astronauts were very likely alive and conscious as their capsule rocketed off and then plunged into the sea. I'm a semi-retired oil geologist and certified master blaster. For the past 5 or so years, my teams and I have volunteered our time and talents in closing abandoned mines. Not just closing these death traps, but also doing rescues and recoveries. I close these death traps permanently with dynamite, C4, RDX, PETN, and my special homebrew nitroglycerine. In the last 5 or so years, my teams and I have rescued over 120 people who thought it'd be a good idea to wander into these murder holes and see what great riches they could grab. Here's a newsflash for anyone entertaining the idiot desire to go into these dangerous, killer holes. They are abandoned for a reason. The simple reason? There's nothing in there of any value. It's all been removed by the owners, and they walked from a dangerous pit, usually out in the middle of absolute nowhere. My teams and I have also recovered 173 bodies in the same time period. Abandoned mines are a Disneyland of death and dismemberment. Bad air, i.e. CO, CO2, H2S, CH4, etc., bad water, lethal molds, viri from animal dens, attacks from the larger megafauna that have set up housekeeping in these holes in the ground, feet-thick layers of bat guano, hantavirus, rotted wood, false floors, abject darkness, pits, adits, tunnels, raises, and winzes that people march blindly into and find themselves falling for a few hundred feet. Over the last couple of months, I have rescued 3 family members, mother and daughters, who thought mines were great for a family walkabout. I also recovered the 2 dead from the same family, father and son, that blindly tumbled down into a shaft over 800 deep. More recently, I recovered a 10-year-old's body from a mine used by the local kids as a hangout. He had Down syndrome and had wandered away from his home over to the mine where he used to hang with his buddies. I recovered his body from under a pile of breakdown, which he triggered only to land on a ledge 300 below the main mine tunnel. The fall must have been terrifying, only to land at 32 Sec 2 on a narrow ledge of rocks that partially blocked the shaft. Unfortunately, the rocks he disturbed on the way down landed on him, crushing him to death. Plus, as a bonus, the rocks that fell to the bottom of the shaft hit old, stagnant water and caused clouds of noxious gases to evolve rapidly to fill the shaft. My team and I had to go full P4 containment suits to recover the poor lad. That mine no longer exists. DuPont Herculene's 70% extra fast, a few kilos of C4, and a gallon of nitro closed that worthless pit for perpetuity. Unfortunately, there are thousands upon thousands of these potential murder holes left existing in all western U.S. states. It's a job I'd gladly quit, but between people's greed and ignorance, I doubt I'll ever be out of work. My friend died out at sea, fell off a cruise in the middle of the night into the Arctic Ocean. Can only imagine how cold and scary that must have been in the pitch black. Still miss him to this day. Sylvia Likens, 16-year-old girl who was raped and tortured in a basement by other kids and the woman who was taking care of her. Eventually, Sylvia died, and there's photos online showing her body carved with "I'm a prostitute and proud." I cried when I saw it the first time. No one should ever go through something like that. I think it's ALS, MND, a terminal illness, which I sadly have. You slowly lose control over every muscle in your body. You can't do anything for yourself. Eventually, you lose the ability to swallow and have to be fed through a tube. Then your lungs get too weak to breathe, and you have to be on a ventilator. All of this while your mind is unaffected, basically being locked in your own body. Bonus points: there is no cure or treatment. We don't know what causes it, and it can happen at any age. Byford dolphin accident. Divers were kept pressurized for weeks to avoid the bends, so they could go down to the ocean floor without having to spend days coming back up. Basically, they lived in a pressurized pod, and when they had to dive, a diving bell was attached to the pod. It was pressurized, and the divers entered it before being sent at the floor. Upon return, they entered their pod again, it was sealed, and the diving bell was depressurized. Because a safety device wasn't installed, workers accidentally left a 5-inch gap between the pod and the bell when depressurizing the bell. Because of this, upon depressurizing the bell, the pod also depressurized, and the guy that was standing near that gap was forced through it due to the high pressure. It was over in an instant for him, but go look at the pictures of the aftermath and you'll see why it's so horrifying. He was turned into a slab of meat.